we are living in this. I mean, you're a very good example of somebody who's now doing things that perhaps a 40-year-old would have been expected to be doing a few years ago, but now you can do it a lot later. You know, you can keep on going, and as you say, this brings with it is kicking it down the road, if you like, but also with all the revolutions in the, as you say, in medicine and what we now know about how we work. Are things like strokes and heart attacks and the cancers and stuff like this, the more we know about the DNA and RNA and all these things, do you see a time coming where even those problems are going to be delayed for, say, hundreds of years rather than just to 100? You know, we're going to be living to 150 and 200, or is that not, from what you can see, that's not going to happen?
Well, I'm the last person in the world you should be asking, but my guess is it won't happen. I mean, we may push it back another 10 years or so, but it looks as if, you know, when you get to 100, 110, 120, the body becomes, all parts of it become pretty frail. I mean, I saw this with Sarah's grandmother, who when she died, she was the oldest person in the United Kingdom, and she was the 19th oldest in the world. She was 112. Now,
Right.
she didn't die because anything had gone wrong. In fact, when they looked at her blood, they sent a blood sample and it came back, and the doctor said, "You sent us the wrong blood sample. This is a 19-year-old." And it was her. But so I interviewed her when she was about 110, died at 112, and she was fine. Her mind was fine. Her body seemed a bit deaf and a bit blind, but you know, she could have gone on. But she fell and she broke a bone, and it wouldn't have healed easily or caused her a lot of pain. So they didn't keep her alive. And that is probably what will happen. I mean, it'll be in, you know, your 110s or 20s, something will happen, and then it's not worth going on. So we may push it back another 10 or 20 years. But it does lead into the question of what my friend Peter Laszlo called the third age. And can I briefly about that? When you're living through a revolution, Tocqueville said, you don't notice it. It's only when it's over that you look back and you say, the French Revolution, that happened. He said it's like falling out of a window. As you're falling down, you don't notice you're falling. It's only when you hit the ground. And the medical revolution and other parts of our housing and so on that has occurred during my lifetime, and it is in my lifetime, is hardly noticed by people, particularly younger people. It's happened, and now we can look back and become aware of it. Because when I was a child, I expected my grandparents, and they expected that they would retire at 60 or whatever it was, younger in the case of many people. And they would live on for another 10, maybe 15 years. But even during those 10 or 15 years, they were old. I sort of remember my grandparents as old. They would have walking sticks, and, you know, for a while they were pretty active, but after the age of sort of 70, you were old. And so you had basically three ages. You had the age when you were being trained and before you took a job. You had the middle age when you went through your earning life and you had children and you were married and so on. And then there was a shortish period. The expectation of life for people, even in a well-fed, fairly healthy country like this, was sort of about 40. That wasn't because people died at 40, but lots of children and infants died. So once you got past the first 10 years or so, you could probably, most people would probably live to 60, 70. But then you die within the next 15 years because one of the old age diseases, a stroke or a heart attack or whatever, was incurable. And so you died from things which now you just go to hospital and be cured of. So in my lifetime, suddenly, the lifespan for ordinary people like myself stretched out, not by 5 years, 10 years, but by 20 or 30 years. You could expect that if you reach the age of 30 or 40, you would probably reach 90 if you're a woman, and mid-80s at least, on average. So many people beyond that. Now, this is a vast transformation. It adds on 20 or 30 years to people's lives, which is absolutely amazing. A third or so of your life is, as we see it, after you have retired, stopped your daytime job. And this both poses huge opportunities and also huge challenges for human beings, because they've never faced this prospect before. And my friend Peter Laslett, who was an academic at Cambridge, and I've talked about before, he was one of the first because he was interested in demography. And so he was very interested in this, particularly when he retired, because he had a particularly fulfilling retirement. He was a fellow of Trinity College, and so he remained in his room and he participated in life in Trinity and lived a good life in his 70s and early 80s. And so he was aware that you could lead a good life. And so why shouldn't other people? So he took an idea which had been invented by the French and then brought it to England, called the University of the Third Age. And he made the first University of the Third Age in Cambridge, which has spread all over England and so on. And the idea there is the simple one, that people are not a spent force, particularly intellectually and creatively, at 60 or 65. They have another 20 or 30 years until around 90 or 95, when they can do all sorts of things they weren't able to do when they weren't having that free time. And so in the rather elite version that he invented, you got the people who had retired to educate each other. Basically, when you retired, you said, I'm a professor of molecular biology and I've retired and I'd like to give some lectures on the DNA revolution. Anyone want to sign up? Or I'm an expert on Italian Renaissance art and I want to go to Italy, and will anyone come with me and I'll do a lecture tour? No money really involved, just interest. And it's been a great success and filled many people. A number of my friends go to these things, and every week or twice a week you'll have your mind stretched and you'll learn Mandarin or you'll learn gardening, practical things as well as. And so he believed, and he wrote a book which the original title was going to be Britain Be Your Age, which was a typical Peter kind of candid title, but it's called something else now. But anyway, in it he describes what's happened and how important it all is for us to understand it. And why it's important to understand what's happened is that unless both governments and individuals take account of what's happened, we will continue to live as if we were in the 19th century in two respects. One I've talked about before, which is that people will go on deluding themselves into thinking that we have a problem of an aging society because we have all these dependent people who've retired but haven't died, and they're kind of battening on the younger people who've got to support them. And as I've pointed out, that is nonsense, because these older people can be doing most of the jobs the younger people do. And particularly, it's not just that they are healthy now, but also there is machinery now, and so you don't have to be particularly old to run a computer or young. And therefore, with the tools we have at our disposal and our minds still very active, there is basically retirement vanishes, and anybody right up to their 80s can do what they feel like. So that's one delusion which we have to get rid of. The other thing that we really have to think about and ponder about, and I have obviously thought about it a lot since I've been retired now for about 12 years, is how you fill retirement.
Mm.
This is related to the University of the Third Age, but it's much wider. And there are a couple of things I'd like to say about that. One is that you should really be aware of this problem really early in your life. This is not just a matter of pension pots and things like that, and financial provision and so on. It's training yourself, because what retirement ideally is a wonderful time for exploration, for discovering new things about yourself and about the world. But exploration has to be done with some training and tools. For example, if you want to spend your older time writing poetry or reading the world's poetry, it's a good idea to have learnt something about poetry early on in your life, to begin to make a platform on which you can stand when you retire. Likewise with all sorts of hobbies and crafts and so on, painting or nature watching or whatever it is. So basically start doing the kind of things that you enjoy early on and become moderately good at them. And that will also excite you in the prospect of more time for them. I mean, most people do this because, as I've said elsewhere, we're a great hobby and sort of interest nation, and most people have these sorts of things. But you need to train people for that. And therefore, it's rather like what I've said about education. We now need to educate people not for a particular job, because they're going to change their jobs all the time, but not even for a life where it's filled with office work and 9 to 5 and duty work. We need to train them for a life of leisure. And this is something which we should be good at in this country, because basically the gentry upwards in Britain have lived that life from time immemorial. I mean, that's why Oxford and Cambridge and public schools were not about the life of the mind. They were about how to drink wine sensibly, or how to ride horses, or how to play games, or how to have friendship. Or so at universities, from very early onwards, you were learning cultural skills, how to appreciate the world and how to use your time, so that when you went to your country estate after your university and become a country gentleman or whatever it was, you would have day after day. I mean, there was nothing to do, basically. If you look at, films of country life on television now, they don't do anything much. They have the butler in and tell him what the day's menus or whatever it is that these people do, or, the gamekeeper and so on. And, you give your instructions in the morning to your servants. And then what do? You fill your life with enjoyable leisure. You build things and you go on travels and now that was what much of British education was about in the past. And it's what British education should be about now. In other words, the justification for putting much more emphasis on things like music and arts and drama and poetry and leisure and friendship and so on is that those are the things that will take you through the last 30 years effectively.
Do you think